As promised, it's time to get back to our window grill project. I've got our full-size layout drugged back out from behind the shop so we can take measurements if we need to. Although there's not much to measure on these, we need to know the finished length, and that's about all we need to know. And I already have a sample, so I can take all of my measurements right off my sample piece. The thing we need to do is forge a tenon, and we'll go through that process at the anvil, and we'll use a few different methods to create that just so we can look at different ways of doing that. And then we need to upset the tenon with a monkey tool to make sure we have a nice square shoulder, and that's really all that has to happen. I'll knock the corners down because I like the chamfered corner look and softer feel of these pieces when we do that. And on two of the bars I want to put a twist in. This center section, I think a twist would look out of place where these scrolls are going to join it, and I think that when doing iron it often looks much better to not have things all the same and to sometimes do some odd numbers. So 3 bars that are not twisted with the ones in between having the twists, and I think that'll look good. I think making all of these bars exactly alike gets redundant. And I don't think we're going to do a real fancy twist here. We might do something a little bit more than just twist it, but I think going out of our way for pineapple twists and Rubik's cubes just doesn't look good in ornamental ironwork. I think that's for fire poker handles and tool handles and things like that. It looks good, but for this, a more simple twist is in order. From shoulder to shoulder, my finished bar is 32 inches. I have cut my pieces 33 and a half inches. So I've left 1.5 inches extra, or 3/4 of an inch, on each end of these. Now I don't need 3/4 of an inch for a tenon, but I would rather have a little extra than risk running just a hair short. So I'm going to mark these actually at 5/8 of an inch. And I'm going to mark all 4 sides. Now if you're doing the math in your head, I've left 3/4 of an inch for each one of these, but I'm only using 5/8 of an inch. That gives me 1/8 of an inch, the monkey tool back, to get this little bit of an upset. And if that all works out, then we're perfect. If not, I'll show you how to make final adjustments. Now, in the interest of making all of this come out just right, I'm going to put a little score mark with a cold chisel that I can index on the edge of my butcher tool. If you remember one of our earlier videos just experimenting with the butcher tool we had made, I got my shoulders way off. That's because I didn't take the time to do a very accurate layout. Taking this little bit extra time will save you a bunch of frustration in the end and is worth it. Another thing we should do before we start forging these bars is mark for our twist. I've marked the center, and I have a center finding rule here which helps me go from each end. You don't have to worry about screwing up your math. Just as easy really to use a plain rule. Because these are 32 inches, I decided to use 1/4 of that, or 8 inches. So I can go from 4 inches to 4 inches on both sides. Get an 8-inch mark, and that's how much twist I'm going to put in each of these bars. And I'm going to take a center punch and lay that out so we can find it again hot. And yes, this punch mark will show in the finished bar. I don't think it hurts at all to show some signs of the process you went through and the fact that you took the time to lay it out and do a nice job. We've done our layout for our bars. We're ready to start forging tenons, and there's just a fairly simple 3 or 4 step procedure that we need to go through to forge each tenon on the end of each bar. So we have 5 bars, 10 tenons total. The very first step is to butcher in. That's the straight-sided tool that looks like a cutoff but isn't quite sharp, and create this shoulder around the edge that we'll be able to work to, that defines what's going to be tenon and separates it from what's going to be the bar. Once that is done, we need to work on creating the basic tenon. Now this can be done either all in some kinds of tenoning dies. You could just go straight from this to this, but generally you'll want to hammer this out roughly, get it close to shape before going in the tenoning die. It'll be a little faster, more efficient, and you'll probably get better results in the long run. But the shoulder, as clean as it looks coming off the butcher, is never perfect at this stage. It's always going to be a little round in here and not quite even. So the final step is to monkey that back with a monkey tool and upset this a little bit and create that nice flat square shoulder that we need for our tenons. And we're going to look at this with different tooling and slightly different processes. Now I sent my butcher we made out of the jackhammer bit off to the winner of the contest, so I've got this ugly thing just to kind of show that you can butcher like this, and by having that chisel mark we can line these up. We get much more predictable marks. The other thing to think about is how big is your tenon. It's a 3/8 tenon on a 1/2 inch bar, so I really don't want to go deeper than about a 1/16 of an inch here. So all I'm really doing is just creating a nice line. And that gives me something I can work to. This is not as good as some of the other options we're going to look at. Mostly because this is way too steep an angle and I need to cut it back or throw it out or do something, because it's not the ideal. It's the absolute minimal tooling we can do this with. Now we can work this out by hand. Be very careful not to mess up where your shoulder is going to be. As you get this down a little bit, and I'm a little premature going to octagon, but it helps me find the shoulder against the edge of the anvil a little bit better. But as you work it down, you get closer and closer to what you want, and it starts to get a little easier to get the hammer in where you want it to be. But you do want to try and forge the tenon down as close as you can to final size by hand. But because that butcher is a pretty ragged tool, this is going to be a fairly ragged tenon. This is going to take more work than it needs to take. That's getting close. One way to measure your tenon size is to just use your monkey tool. So that goes over, but this shoulder here is still really bad, really ugly. At this point, I think the thing to do would be to file this to clean that up. I think trying to forge it, we're going to push some of that down. So this tool, because of that sharp angle, is just terrible. But we can still save it. Like I say, I can take a hot rasp or file, I can file this down, and I can make a usable tenon out of it. Let's take a look at this spring butcher that we made. This is the one all out of mild steel, out of one piece. There's a video on this. The hardy shank could be longer, and that would help it balance, and you could wedge it if you needed to. But that makes a much cleaner shoulder, and it makes it much faster. I think I'm going to make it just a hair deeper, but not too deep. If you go too deep, when you draw this out, it stretches and you end up with a little cut right there, and that creates a weak place. So you don't actually want to go down to 3/8 square at this point. You want it a little bit big. So this tool, even though I wasn't very happy with it just because it's kind of crude for how much work we put into it, is a much better tool than that first bottom butcher. And the one that we shipped out for the 10,000 subscriber giveaway is way better than that first one. So that's all I want to do. You'll notice I knocked the corners off. This is going to be round, so there's no reason to not start going to octagon with the butcher. At this point, it's the same thing we did before. We'll draw that out by hand. So this tool produced completely adequate results and gives us a better shoulder to forge to here. Still got to be careful. It's really easy to mess these up at this stage. If you start out at the end and watch where your hammer blows are, you might do better than trying to just aim your hammer. See where the impact was, and then move it back in a little bit. And again, this will take a couple of heats to get that close. And this gets to be very difficult to refine right up against the shoulder without some sort of a die that actually fits that. It is theoretically possible with a hammer, but I think it is very difficult to bring this down tight to the shoulder with a hand hammer. So to really round that tenon up right to the shoulder, you need some sort of a die that it fits in. And if it shoulders up tight, that keeps you, as long as you have control over your die, you get a nice clean tenon with minimum fuss. Now this is the die that we made, did a video on. No forge welding, tool steel dies, or spring steel, but hardened. Mild steel shank, mild steel spring, all riveted together, no forge welding, no arc welding, and this will do the same thing. That will round that up. So let's look at an entire tenon done under that tool. And because I made this for a 1-inch hardy hole, it's pretty sloppy, so I'm going to put a spacer in here, and that's going to help that out quite a bit. It'd be good to have a spacer going both directions. Now this has a butcher just like our other butcher. You need to be able to find the edge there where we made our little chisel cut. Now this would be better if this were tighter. So I think this spring needs to be adjusted a little bit. So we made that little adjustment to this. And that's much better. There's not as much bounce opportunity. That's just enough to get that butcher in there at just the right depth, because we don't want to go too deep. So now we'll still need to start this by hand at the anvil. So this looks just like it did before to start this by hand. But this time I don't think we need to try and go so far because we have a tool to finish this with. So you just want to give it a head start, really. Now we can insert this in the round part of that die. And let's work kind of slowly. Make sure your shoulder is up tight to the die each time. And rotate it 90 degrees each time. And then you can start doing the corners and kind of go kind of square octagon around. You'll also notice this sticks out, so you need to pull that protrusion back in and work that part of it as well. So that's ending up with a much nicer round. Still needs a little work. I just put another little shim in here to help hold this in the hardy hole. That's going to be better. And just roll this around, take your time, work it end to end. As it gets close, you don't have to go quite to the 90-degree increments. We'll do a whole video sometime on how to make hardy tools that can be secured to the anvil if you feel like you need it. This is all just a matter of being too small a shank for this anvil. I did intentionally because this tool technically now belongs to somebody else because we already gave it away. So that's getting much closer. I think one more round and that'll go into our monkey tool. This tool works much better. And now that goes into our monkey tool, so we'll take another heat and we'll go ahead and monkey this one. But that's all we need this tool for. That's now ready to go to its new owner. And I wish I remembered his full name, but I don't want to mess it up, so I'm not going to mention it on the video. I can take my little shims out of there, get rid of them. But you can do all 10 of these on this tool. I'm just doing the one to show you how this tool worked, and I'm going to show you a few other tools and a few other options to do a few more of these tenons. Now, we made monkey tools in a previous video. This is just so you can upset this shoulder and make sure it's a good square shoulder in line with your tenon. But you can screw this up because things will start to bow, so check it often and make sure things are going down straight. The monkey tool also cools this off quick, so you may take a few heats to do this. And like most upsetting, light blows, quick blows, seem to go a little bit better. So that's getting a nice little upset shoulder on it. I'm pretty happy with. And that's all there is to the monkey tool. I'm going to start chamfering this now because this part is done. And if you end up messing with the shoulder when you chamfer it, then it isn't quite done. And you just come back and give a little tap there. All it really takes. So all of these tenons that we have shown, whether you're trying to draw them out by hand, you have to refine them a little bit by hot rasping, or if you've got a die that makes it just the right size, the final step is to use the monkey tool, and that looks the same for all of them. We've looked at the Smithing Magician with its butcher tool several times. This is still one of my favorite ways to butcher a bar because everything is nice and secure. It doesn't get bouncy too bad, and it really does a nice job. And again, I shouldn't say Smithing Magician, even though that's what brand this is. It's a guillotine tool, and any guillotine tool should be able to do essentially the same thing. But I can roll that around. I can work the corners a little bit more. And that's really all the difficulty there is to form the end of that tenon. Now we can work this at the anvil just like we have been. But with this guillotine tool and these step dies that are flat, instead of being a half round like most tenoning dies, we can actually work this right from the butchered end. We can line that up with the edge of the butcher and go square octagon round, and this produces a very nice shoulder. And these are set for 3/8, so we can go down until they bottom out at a 3/8 square. Then we can go to octagon and come up with a 3/8 octagon. And then we can go to round. Remember to do the whole tenon. This won't let you go too far, but if you have any oddities, you may not be at a full 3/8 round, so you may have to revisit it a few times. I can tell that's too big. That's not going to go over there. So I need to get that hot and do that just a little bit more. And it doesn't hurt to draw out a little bit of the end by hand. If it ends up a hair small, it won't hurt anything. As long as right up by the shoulder everything's the right size. And that gives you less you have to work under the dies. Little tappy blows to kind of refine it there. Retrieve the monkey tool from the ground where you dropped it. And it's still not quite small enough, so there's still just a little bit more work. Those dies still come up in the air just about a 1/16 of an inch when I put it under there, so they're not quite touching. So there is certainly an advantage to the round die that refines this whole thing. But this can be a very forgiving way to do this, and this same die will create square tenons or a flat tongue on something. Now it's starting to fit. I think one more heat and we'll be there. You see those dies bounce that high? It's almost a sure sign that it's down to size, and it is. We'll monkey the shoulder, and we may need 2 heats because it's fairly cool. Remember, check it for straight and straighten it if you need to. And then I start chamfering these edges. That we've seen all that done before. And that's another tenon. Now perhaps my favorite way to make a tenon, and certainly the most efficient because I've got the tools to do it, is to do the butchering in the butchers on the Smithing Magician, because it is so precise and I can really see what's going on. And I rough out that tenon under the power hammer. That gives me a pretty good round tenon very quickly because of the shoulders on the power hammer. And then I go to a handheld tenoning die. It's handheld back here so my hands aren't close to the power hammer. And that's pretty much all I need to do for that tenon. Except, of course, for the bit with the monkey tool, because that still needs to be done. And I think I showed you an air-powered or monkey tool that fits in an air chisel or an air gun previously. And that's certainly an option if you're doing production work. I don't think 10 tenons is enough production to warrant dragging an air hose out. So the next thing I want to do, we've started chamfering all these bars. This is one with a center punch mark for the twist. And I don't like chamfering by twists. I like the sharp corner in the twist. So I'm going to chamfer right up to the center punch mark. So just make sure I know where that punch mark is, and we go ahead and put a little chamfer on the corners. You don't have to do this. It's just an aesthetic that I like, so I do this. And then make sure the bar is straight. So the next thing we want to do is decide what twist I want to put in this. And I think it's going to be fairly simple. I'm going to chisel a line from center punch mark to center punch mark right down the center, flip it 180 degrees and repeat that. But I'm not going to do anything on the other two faces. And then we'll twist it and see what that looks like. This could be a hair hotter perhaps, but it'll work at this heat. Yeah, let's take another heat and heat that last little bit up. So, that is all we need to do to that. It's time to twist it. You start off with it straight, your twist will end up better. Having a nice even heat makes a real big difference on this. If you have to do it in increments because your forge won't heat this long, just do it in increments. Use water to cool off the parts that twist too fast, or torch to heat up the parts that twist too slowly. I think I like the looks of that. Here's our twist. Very gently straightening this in the vise on the diamond can help get it straight, but ultimately we need to take this to a wooden block. Then use a rawhide mallet, I think, to make sure that's good and straight. You may want to let this cool just almost to a black heat before straightening it on a stump, and maybe even let it cool 100% for the very last straightening. This is a really easy way to bend it too much if it's too floppy and too hot. So by using a rawhide mallet and a wooden stump, you end up not knocking that nice crisp corner that I intentionally left behind. And doing it cold at this stage will be just fine. Now it's critical in this kind of work that all of these are exactly the same length. They're not the same length. When you rivet your tenons, you're going to have to either push the rails out a little bit or pull them in a little bit, and you're going to end up with a wavy rail. Maybe you like that. I think that's probably not what you're going for. So you should take one of your hook rulers that you made in the shop, and you should mark the one that's right, or mark it based on your drawing if your drawing is critical, and check all of these and make them right. So how do we do that? Let me see what I've got here. Here's one. Those two are good. This one is short, so it needs to be longer. That one is a hair short and could be longer. And that one is a hair short. So I ended up with two that are the right length and three that are just a little bit short. It is important to check these cold. Iron and steel expand and stretch when they're hot and contract when they're cool. And depending on how hot it is when you check your measurement, depends on how much it's stretched. Something this long could be a 1/4 inch off at heat. So if you check it at heat against a cold measurement, it's going to get shorter as it cools. If you check them all at the same heat, you can get a pretty accurate relative measurement. But make your final check cold. Now I think that is, we're about 1/8 of an inch off. So we can stretch 1/8 of an inch cold. You might be able to do it on the face of the anvil just by drawing it out a little bit. Don't go too far, otherwise you might have to put it back. But this is the one that was worse. You might need to go to the horn. If it's really short, you might have to do this hot. And if it's really, really short, you might have to make another one because you screwed up so bad. And make sure it's straight because this is going to have some effect on the measurement. I'm measuring shoulder to shoulder. So that's just almost there. I'm going to do just a little more. But the tenon length is more than enough. I'm going to have to cut those anyways, but it's shoulder to shoulder that defines where that rail is going to sit. The tenon is going to get upset and pushed back, so that's not really a big deal. If you have a power hammer, it's real easy to stretch these just a little bit under a power hammer. Now what if it's too long? Now just a hair too long, just heat up the end, put the monkey tool on it, upset that shoulder a little bit more, you can shorten it some. If it's more than a hair too long, you might need to heat up a little more or heat up in several places and make a series of little tiny upsets that shouldn't be noticeable in the final project. You don't want a big swell, you just want to take up some of that material. You could also file this shoulder down a little bit if you need to, and just do it as a stock removal thing, just use a file or hot rasp. But again, you'll need to let it cool completely to make your final check. So that's important to make these fit. And I'm going to check these 2 or 3 times before we assemble it and make sure these are all exactly the same length, that I have good crisp shoulders on the tenons. If I need to hit them with a file, I will. Clearly, I'm going to need to assemble this on a bigger bench or a set of sawhorses. But we have our rails, and we have our vertical bars or pickets, or perhaps they're balusters, although I don't think that's the right word. And this stuff is almost ready to assemble. There will be a little bit of tweaking and adjusting just before we assemble, and that'll be covered as part of the assembly process. But we're getting closer. This is starting to come together. The next thing we need to do is make our scrolls. I've only drawn 2, but it needs 4 identical scrolls. One here, 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 and here. We'll do that, then we'll make the collars, and once all that is done, we will be ready to assemble. So scrolls will be the next thing, and we will also take a look at making a scroll form if you need to make repetitive scrolls. The project is really starting to come along. You get an idea what it's going to look like. You can see how the twists compare. I did a fairly simple twist. If you want to do something more complicated, you can. But I think getting too complicated in a project like this will start to distract from it. There are places for fancy twists in this kind of work. I just personally didn't think that's what I wanted in this. Your project, your design, you do what you feel is best with it. And of course, it doesn't have to be exactly the same as this anyways. This is just showing the progression of how you go about making one of these, or something similar to this. So we have a playlist. If you're joining us late, I will try to link to the playlist right up in here when I get a chance. And you can go look at the playlist for the wrought iron window grill. Again, this is not real wrought iron. It's just replicating what people call wrought iron now. Even though it has nothing to do with wrought iron, we're using that name just to clarify that we're making a real forged version of the tacky wrought iron that gets sold all over the world. So take a look at that playlist. It will follow you through design, full-size layout, the whole concept, making tools up to this point. We may have to make more tools yet before we get to the end of it, and if we do, we will make those. And that's all part of doing something like this, is making the tools you need to do the work. And that's one of the things we get to do as blacksmiths that a lot of other craftspeople don't get to do, because we can make tools like butchers and chisels and punches. So that's really a wonderful thing to be able to do. So I hope you like this. I hope it's been valuable up to this point, and I hope you'll join us as we continue on this. It won't always be one video right after the other. We've been working on it for a few months now, here and there, and that's the way we'll keep doing it, so that it doesn't become the only thing we're doing on this YouTube channel. If you liked it, love it if you give it a thumbs up. Love it if you'd hit that subscribe button down there. If you'd like to support the channel financially and help finance the efforts that we're doing here, there is a link down in the description for PayPal or Patreon if you'd like to make a more regular donation. There is no obligation. The content is free. The content will remain free. That is just a donation if you so choose. In the meantime, get out to your shop, make something, practice your skills, challenge your abilities, but stay safe. Wear your safety glasses, and we'll see you for the next one.